Welcome back to The Unexpected Atheist. Today was a typical day for me, which meant that I thought, and I thought deeply about life, as I usually do. And the thought that I had today as I was taking a couple loads of garbage out to the dumpster was that I would not have deconverted from Christianity based on a lot of very popular reasons that people deconvert. For example, issues that people have with how could God have created everything out of nothing? And I can't wrap my head around that whole concept of ex nihilo creation, where God speaks and everything comes into existence. I wouldn't deconvert because of the lack of archaeological evidence for the Israelites wandering around on the Sinai Peninsula. Was watching a program on Jamestown, which I might visit later this fall, and archaeologists there in Virginia have uncovered 1 million artifacts from that early settlement. Well, there weren't that many people there, hundreds, maybe thousands, in a settlement that was founded in 1607 and ran to, the fort wasn't that long, but the town itself was, I think, until about 1698. That's not a long time. Well, the Israelites were there in the desert for 40 years, which is a good chunk of time, and by some reports had up to 2 million Israelites traipsing around in the desert. And yet, from what I understand, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence for their existence during that time in that place. That's problematic to me, and I want to look into that for sure. But even that is not enough to compel me to deconvert. It's not even the lack of systematic theology. I mean, I wish that at the end of Revelation, there were an appendices written by God himself, not just some team of theologians, where he would break everything down. Here's the doctrine of the church, here's the doctrine of this, here's the doctrine of that. It's not there. I wouldn't deconvert by wondering about how strange it is for Solomon to have basically 700 wives. All right, concubines, whatever. Had a conservative friend in college who was like, just think about it. Solomon could have dinner with a different woman every night. I'm like, yeah. I wouldn't deconvert over confusion regarding how the canon was created. At the end of the life of Christ, the end of the early church, and how that whole thing came together, which is incomprehensible to me. I wouldn't deconvert based on the relative lack of historical evidence for a real Jesus. Now, I believe there's enough in writings to substantiate the existence of a person who was named Jesus, who was the leader of Jews in the first century. I don't think there's any question about that, but there's still a lot that could be given that just simply isn't there in the historical record from archaeology or just other writings. My issue is not even with miracles. As bizarre as some of those sound, from Jonah being swallowed by the whale or the big fish or whatever it was, from the axe head floating, and on it goes. Because if you have a God who created the universe and created the laws of nature, then certainly he should be able to control the universe and superintend those laws of nature at his will. So whatever. There's a degree of faith, certainly, that is in play here. And I get that. That's why faith is faith. It's a game of faith. And I think that faith can appear to be reasonable, at least on a surface level. That's not my problem. I can walk through life and feel okay about the potential of believing, even with a paucity of evidence, because the Bible pitches it ultimately as an issue of faith. You believe that God exists, that he rewards those who diligently seek him, and et cetera, et cetera. My issue is what I addressed in the last video in this series, which is the lack of epistemological correspondence. And what I mean by that is the Bible does not seem to work in my life. It doesn't seem to work in the lives of other people that I've had experience with, not just on the short-term basis, but for decades, my entire life. And I'm also very interested in history, just from a very amateur level. And I look at history quite closely to see if I can discern evidence of the providence of God, of the hand of God in play over the events of history. And of course, when you've got that much data to play with, you can always put on the Christian glasses and read into it as you will. But two historical eras that I have looked at here in the last 24 hours that have fascinated me. Number one, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1822. There's a wonderful program on, I believe it was The American Experience. It's either on Prime Video or on Netflix that I ended up watching. And here we are, America, a supposedly Christian country, and we're about 100 years after our founding. So, we're past 100 years after our founding, 1882. And by that point, we should have had a chance to mature, right? I mean, if we're all the Christian country that David Barton and all those people claim in terms of our, Christian heritage, then we should be mature by that point. And yet, the way that we treat the Chinese immigrants who were brought in for labor to build the railroads and so forth is just appalling. And I won't go into details about that and the whole series of acts that were passed to basically pressure them to leave the country. And the whole thing seems incredibly un-Christian, incredibly out of line with the fruit of the Spirit, incredibly out of line with the Beatitudes, and even with just the philosophy that Jesus seemed to portray in the New Testament about welcoming the poor. So, again, looking for the hand of God in that whole documentary that covered all those different acts. And, ultimately what brought about their greater acceptance in the American culture was their challenging through the court of law these different acts, and in particular using the 14th Amendment. So what brought about the change was something very natural. It was a natural cause leading to a natural effect. That I can see. What I don't see is the invisible hand of God playing a role in that whole story. And you can say the same thing with Native Americans and the way the colonists treated them as well. And, of course, with the slavery issue. So that's the first historical era that I've been really thinking through today. The second, real briefly, is that of Jamestown in Virginia, the Jamestown settlement. And again, going back to this picture of God creating the United States of America to show forth his glory and to do all the stuff, connect with the manifest destiny and all that, to create a Christian nation. And yet, if you look at what happened at Jamestown, it was such a bungled operation that it's frankly surprising that that particular settlement lasted at all. I mean, you think, okay, if God's in control of this situation, then he picks a year, 1607, that was the worst drought that the Virginia area had seen apparently in 700 years. I don't know who was keeping track of that for 700 years, but that's what talking heads said on some of the historical programs. And because of that, it increased the salt content of an already brackish water that was flowing into the James River, leading to the death of potentially a lot of the settlers who were drinking that salty water. The settlement resorted to cannibalism, sunk all the way down to that level because they were starving. They didn't have food supplies. They didn't have the ability to grow food, et cetera, et cetera. The whole thing was such an incredible mess. They would bring over 9 ships, for example, to resupply, the food and clothing and other things, and 3 of them wouldn't make it, so only 6 would have arrived, and those were heavily damaged. A lot of those goods were lost. I don't see the hand of God at the founding of Jamestown. And that is this holy of holy sites, in a sense, if you're going to claim that America is a Christian nation. You should see the fingerprints of God all over it. What I saw were the marks of cannibalism on the young 14-year-old girl named Jane that they dug up. Wasn't her real name, but they named her that. And she apparently died a few months after coming to Jamestown at about 1609. And yeah, they ate her. And you can see the marks of that all over her body. I see that, but I don't see the hand of God. And again, it's that lack of epistemological correspondence. I don't see the power of the gospel in clear and obvious ways in my life, in the lives of others around me, or in the full scope of history. Now, it doesn't mean I'm closed-minded. I'm still looking. I'm still going to research more history. I'm going to constantly be processing. But at this stage, that's where I'm at.